Walk onto the bridge of almost any container ship on Earth, a South Korean-built vessel flying a Panamanian flag, owned by a Greek shipping family, chartered by a Danish carrier, and there's a good chance the officer standing watch, the engineer below deck, and half the crew eating dinner in the mess hall all come from the same country. Not China, not Greece, not Norway, Panama, or any of the nations whose names are painted on the hull or stamped on the registry papers. The Philippines. Roughly 1 out of every 4 sailors on the planet is Filipino. Out of a global seafaring workforce of about 1.6 million people, close to 400,000 of them come from a single archipelago of just over 100 million people. They man close to a third of the entire world's merchant fleet, the tankers carrying your gasoline, the bulk carriers hauling grain and coal, the container ships stacked with everything from smartphones to sneakers, and increasingly, the cruise ships too. That's the Anomaly. A middle-income country with no shipbuilding industry to speak of, no major shipping conglomerate, and not a single one of the world's largest carriers headquartered on its soil somehow ended up supplying the literal muscle and expertise that keeps 90% of global trade moving across oceans it doesn't own, on ships it doesn't build, for companies it doesn't control. So how does a country with almost none of the capital in global shipping end up owning almost a quarter of its labor? To understand it, you have to rewind to a decision that had nothing to do with ships at all. In the 1970s, the world's ship owners were bleeding money. Oil shocks had crushed freight demand, fleets were overbuilt, and operating costs, especially European and American crew wages, were eating ship owners alive. So they did what capital always does when labor gets expensive. They went looking for cheaper labor somewhere else, and they found a legal loophole to get it. That loophole was the flag of convenience. Ship owners started registering their vessels not in the country where the company was based, but in places like Panama and Liberia, where regulations were lighter and, crucially, where there was no requirement to hire national crews at national wages. The moment a ship stopped being legally tied to one country's labor force, ship owners could hire from anywhere on Earth, and that single regulatory shift cracked open a global labor market for sailors that had never really existed before. The Philippines was ready for that opening in a way almost no other country was. This is where the first principle comes in. Comparative advantage isn't just about cost, it's about a bundle of traits that are expensive to build and nearly impossible to copy quickly. The Philippines is an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands, so a maritime culture wasn't invented for this industry, it already existed for centuries, long before Spanish galleons crossed the Pacific between Manila and Acapulco. Decades of American colonial administration left behind an English-based education system, which mattered enormously on ships where the international working language by law is English. And in 1974, under Ferdinand Marcos, the Philippine government made labor export official state policy, building an entire bureaucracy, what's now the Department of Migrant Workers, specifically to recruit, train, certify, and deploy Filipino workers to jobs. Overseas, seafaring chief among them. Here's the concrete version of how that machine works today. There are more than 80 maritime academies across the Philippines, churning out roughly 280,000 maritime graduates every single year. Most won't get an immediate berth on a ship, only a small fraction do in any given year, but that oversupply is the point. It means shipping companies calling Manila manning agencies always have a deep, ready, pre-certified pool to draw from, trained to international conventions, medically cleared, and available almost immediately. Compare that to trying to recruit an equivalent crew from Germany or Japan, where wages are higher, the maritime labor pool has shrunk for decades, and there's no equivalent training pipeline turning out hundreds of thousands of certified candidates a year. The math for a shipowner isn't close. Let's do the actual maths a shipping company does, because this is where the decision stops being about culture and starts being about a spreadsheet. Say a mid-sized bulk carrier needs to fill an entry-level able seaman position. Hiring from a traditional Western maritime nation might mean a monthly wage in the thousands of dollars once benefits, union requirements, and repatriation costs are factored in, plus a shrinking pool of candidates even willing to take the job, because land-based wages at home are competitive with a life spent away from family for 9 months at a stretch. Hiring the same role through a Manila-based manning agency costs a fraction of that, draws from a training pipeline turning out hundreds of thousands of new graduates a year, and comes with none of the recruitment friction because the entire system, agencies, medical clearance, certification, standby crews already exists purely to serve this one export industry. Multiply that gap across every rank on every ship and it isn't a marginal savings. It's the difference between a viable crewing budget and an unviable one. That's the first principle's engine. Once flags of convenience decouple a ship's nationality from its crew's nationality, the cheapest, most reliable, most scalable labor pool on Earth was always going to win. And for 50 years, that's been the Philippines. Now scale that one hiring decision across the entire industry. Roughly 400,000 Filipinos are deployed on ships in any given year, manning close to 30% of the world's merchant fleet. In dollar terms, this isn't a footnote, it's one of the country's largest single sources of foreign income. Filipino seafarers send home well over $6 billion a year, money that flows directly into households, funds tuition, builds houses, and supports an entire domestic economy of migration built around families with someone at sea. On the Philippine side, seafaring isn't a curiosity, it's treated as a strategic national industry, sometimes even called the country's fourth arm of national defense, because in wartime, a merchant marine trained at that scale is also a mobilizable maritime workforce. But here's the detail that makes this more than a simple cheap labor story. There's a structural reason competitors haven't caught up, and it isn't really about money at all, it's about who else needs their own sailors. China is the world's largest shipbuilder and operates one of its largest and fastest growing merchant fleets. But China's own shipping companies need enormous numbers of Chinese crew just to staff China's own ships. There's very little surplus labor left over to export to the rest of the world's fleet. India has a huge population and produces a significant and rising share of the world's officers, but its economy is absorbing labor into other booming sectors. So its seafaring supply, while serious competition, hasn't overtaken the Philippines at the aggregate scale. The Philippines, by contrast, has chronic underemployment on land. Seafaring wages, even modest ones by Western standards, are life-changing at home. That mismatch, an economy that can't fully absorb its own workforce onshore, paired with a training pipeline built specifically to export labor to a global industry with genuine demand, is what keeps the supply flowing at a scale almost no other nation can match. That dominance is now being tested. The same global shipping industry is short on officers. The shortage is measured in the tens of thousands and growing, because it's far harder and more expensive to train someone into a ship's command structure than to train a rating for entry-level deck or engine work. The Philippines has historically supplied huge numbers of ratings, the lower-tier crew roles, but comparatively fewer senior officers, and that officer gap is where competitors like India have been closing distance fastest. There's also a demographic clock running. Filipino seafaring has an aging cohort of senior officers, while newer entrants skew toward entry-level roles, and only a small percentage of maritime graduates ever get a seat on board at all, which threatens the long-term pipeline even as short-term deployment numbers keep climbing. In 2025, the Philippine government responded by passing what's been called the Magna Carta of Filipino Seafarers, a sweeping new law meant to raise protections, standardize contracts, and modernize training, essentially an attempt to defend the country's dominant market position the same way a company defends market share against rising competitors. Then came the stress test that exposed exactly how load-bearing this arrangement really is. When the pandemic shut down borders in 2020, commercial shipping never stopped. It was declared essential because the alternative was empty shelves and fuel shortages worldwide. But the humans crewing those ships couldn't get off them. Countries closed airports, sealed ports to crew changes, and shut down the entire rotation system that lets sailors finish a contract and go home. At the peak of the crisis, an estimated 400,000 seafarers were effectively stranded at sea, many well past the end of legally mandated contracts, some for a year or more, unable to disembark in port after port. Because the Philippines supplies such an outsized share of the world's crews, it also absorbed an outsized share of that crisis. Filipino sailors who'd left home for a standard 9-month contract found themselves trapped on vessels for 18 months, unable to see families who in some cases were dealing with their own pandemic emergencies back home with no one able to help. The global supply chain that the entire world depended on to keep functioning was, at that exact moment, running almost entirely on the goodwill and endurance of workers with no leverage to demand it stop. The crisis didn't just embarrass the industry, it forced governments and the International Maritime Organization to formally recognize seafarers as key workers and push the Philippines to fast-track vaccination and repatriation logistics, specifically because so much of global trade quietly depended on getting its own citizens home and back out again. So the ship itself was never really the whole story. The steel is South Korean or Chinese. The flag is Panamanian or Liberian, chosen for legal convenience, not nationality. The owner might be Greek, the charter Danish, the cargo Chinese manufactured and American bound. but the human system that actually operates the vessel, that keeps the engine running and the watch standing and the cargo secured through a typhoon in the South China Sea, disproportionately traces back to one country that owns none of the capital and controls none of the routes. Ownership gets you the ship, it doesn't get you the crew. And in an industry built entirely around who's willing to move, one nation figured out, 50 years before anyone else, how to make its own people the most exportable commodity in global shipping. Thanks for watching.